Okay, so my talk is called Let's Web Dev Like It's 1999, right? So I'm going to take us all back on my development journey. So it's a little bit about me, but hopefully we'll learn some things from the past, apply them to the present, and maybe take a walk down memory lane for some of us, or a history lesson for the rest of us. So actually, before we start, is there anybody who was doing development back in 1999? Okay. Okay, was anybody, or there's some people who weren't born yet in 1999. I'm sure there's some like elementary school or later or earlier. You were two. Okay. So the answer is no. You weren't. You weren't. Okay. So, I want to let you know that the slides are already up if anybody ends up being interested in this. So you can take a picture of that QR code. I also have a link to the slides there at the bottom and such. So there's all these kind of ways you can find the slides. You could follow along if you wanted to, but the screen is pretty big, so that's probably not necessary. So my first programming language that I learned was BASIC, if anybody's heard of that. And I learned it in a summer program in 1998. I think I was maybe in ninth grade, something like that. And I used this skill that I learned to actually program TI-83, my TI-83 calculator. So who here has used a TI calculator? Okay, that's good. The HP was, so I used the TI-83. There were probably new ones that came out afterwards and such. So I would manually type on my calculator in T9, if anybody remembers that, right? So to type in a C, it's like 2, 2, 2, and then to type in other letters and such. So it took forever, but I still was able to build some math games that I used in my algebra tests to verify that my answers were correct, you know, before teachers caught on to what I was doing. But I mean, I wrote the game, so I must have known what I was doing, right? So anyway, I started sharing these apps that I was building online. Okay, but there was no GitHub, there was no App Store, none of those types of things. So there were just websites where you could put files up there. And folks would ask me, like, how do you write TI games? Like, what? Please teach me, right? So I started creating these TI tutorials. And since I was using Windows at the time, I would use Windows help files to create these, right? And they're kind of like this hypercard. You have a screen, you can click to another screen, kind of like early web type things. But to be able to share an HLP file was really difficult, right? So I decided instead of trying to distribute files like this, let me just put tutorials on the web. So naturally, I created my own website. So I went to the Wayback Machine, all right, and it took me way back to 2000, right? So this was the very first site I ever built, okay, and I called it Basic Guru Online because apparently at the age of 16, I was a guru in Basic, right, already, and it was hosted on GeoCities. Okay, does anybody remember GeoCities? Angel Fire, like all of those kind of web platforms, you know, they existed way before Netlify and Vercel and all those kind of things. So I'm talking like early 2000s at this point. So the website, GeoCities, handled all the back end. So like submitting forms and stuff like that via plugins, and I did all the front end stuff. So back then also, I think somebody was talking about it earlier. So there was no CI/CD platforms back then. What I would do is I would FTP into their server, right? And the FTP was basically a Windows Explorer on my machine, and I could open a file up in what was probably Notepad, make a change, save, changed on the website immediately. Like, that was as fast as it went, right? And it was, I mean, that's pretty cool, right? It's like kind of the equivalent of SSHing into a server, but like immediately I could change the website, which was pretty cool, but also pretty dangerous. So let me quickly go through the website real quick so you can marvel in my sophisticated development. All right, so at the top, I had my logo, which I definitely stole the clip art from PowerPoint and then sprinkled in some Comic Sans because that was all the rage back then, picked different colors for the letters for whatever reason. And then I had a hit counter, which was also very popular in the time. It was not working on the Wayback Machine, unfortunately, but back then it definitely did. And I had no need for Google Analytics or anything like that. Everybody knew how many views I was getting on my website. Did I need 5 digits? Let's say yes. I did need 5 digits. It probably got to 99,999 and just flipped back to 0. That's what happened. That's the story I'm going to tell. And then I had a date. I showed the date on there, and it actually still worked when I pulled this screenshot. So that's why JavaScript is backwards compatible, so that 20 years later, someone can go to a site and it still works, right? I don't know why I thought I needed to tell people what the date was, but apparently I thought that was important. And then this section has this recent updates there, and apparently at the very least I had 70 members who registered for this site. I really wonder what Matt Hamlin is doing these days, and did he know that he was on a site of a teenager? But yeah, I had that, and then finally at the bottom, that's highlighted there, you may not be able to see it, but I say that the website will work best in the AOL browser, if that dates me at all. I say probably could work in IE, which was probably IE4 at the time, Netscape Navigator, which was a predecessor to Firefox, I guess. And it says best viewed in an 800 by 600 monitor. Imagine that. Imagine that. And this what? That was high res back then. That was like what, 0.125K maybe back then. So the screenshot. Oh, probably at 1080p, probably. I don't remember. But yeah, exactly. It was very responsive. So then at the bottom, we have this weekly poll here. So apparently at the time when the Wayback Machine got there, I was asking what speeds people were using browsing it, right? So minimum being 14.4. You know, with the modem sound. I really wish I knew what the results were at the time. But then at the bottom, I have this kind of frame, a fixed frame, which was the navigation. And then everything above it scrolled just fine. But instead of having my navigation at the top, I had it fixed at the bottom. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So if you are at all curious to see this website, you can scan that QR code and it'll take you to the website. And because I found the code on an old hard drive, took it, put it on GitHub, and then hosted it on Vercel. No build step needed. It was just all raw HTML and CSS. And there it is. And you can also go to the GitHub and make fun of me in my teenage code. So just for fun, this is what Yahoo looked like at the same time, right? So not really that much better than my site, really. And this is also what Amazon looked like at the same time. At the bottom, you can see it says, if you can, it says Microsoft XP is now shipping. So this is back when they actually just sold books, funny enough. So fast forward 2 decades later, I have a website, binmvp.com, that's written in Gatsby, React components, TypeScript, Webpack, GraphQL, like all of these things, just to make a personal website. And in the end, it always builds down to HTML and CSS, the same version I was using back when I was writing code. So it's kind of cyclical, I guess, but the whole development experience is completely changed. Okay, So before I continue, though, can I convince everyone to stand up? I need everyone to stand up. So you got to push your little tray away. Okay, it's the end of the day. I was definitely yawning. You are definitely yawning. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We are going to do 10 air squats all together. Okay? Yeah, so, if you need to stretch out a little bit beforehand, I don't want anybody getting any Charlie horses or anything like that. Okay? So I'll count it out. And, let's start at 0 since it's a, JavaScript and whatnot. Okay? Here we go. 0. 1, 2, we're really doing it. 3, 4, halfway. 5, 6, yes. 7, 8, 9. See, overflow. Nope, that was it. Okay, yes. All right. Okay, great job. Have a seat. Thanks for indulging me and all of that. So just to formally introduce myself, my name is Ben Alegbadu. I am a Christian, a husband, and a father. Here's my family right here. Obviously, that's me on the left, and my wife, Rashida. She's on the right there. We've been married for 12 and a half years. Yeah, now. 13 in September. And that's our oldest daughter, Simone, behind my wife there. She is 9 years old. Our middle daughter, Avery, is behind me. She is 6 and a half. And then right there in the center, not wanting to take the picture, sulking away, is our son, Asher. He's 4 years old. I probably didn't let him have an icy or something. Who knows? But he was not happy and definitely didn't want to pose for the picture. So we live in Houston, Texas, in a suburb called Manville, Texas. Used to live in the Bay Area, lived there for 20 years, in fact. From Houston, went there, now back home. So I am a Google developer expert and also also work at Stitch Fix. So if you're not familiar with Stitch Fix, it's an online shopping platform. We combine technology, data science, a real stylist, put it together to give you a great shopping experience, and clothes will show up at your door that you will hopefully like and come at whatever frequency that you want. But enough about me. I actually want to talk about a friend of mine really quickly. So he attended the Berkeley Coding Boot Camp. I think it was a 12-week camp, immersive camp, a few years back. And these are all the skills that he learned in that camp, right? I think they're like 20 or something like that. So not just HTML, not just CSS and JavaScript, command line and Git, which are table stakes basically now, jQuery, Bootstrap, React, Django, Express, MongoDB, all of these things just to try to get an entry-level position, right? So we were just talking about that earlier. So like the bar now to try to make it is so high, right? What's minimally viable is amazingly high compared to what it was when I was starting, right? We go to meetups, we go to conferences just to try to learn as much as we can to be able to stay current with what's going on. But yeah, like I said, when I was starting, the bar wasn't so high. It was really low, if it existed at all, right? We were making things up as we went, basically, setting standards as we went, I guess. So I want to look back at some various things that we used to do, or at least, very least, I used to do back in the day, all right? So before there was CSS3 Flexbox and CSS3 Grid, we needed a way to lay things out on the page. And many times we would have a navigation, we would have maybe a header at the top, something on the left, something on the right, main code in the middle, right? So you may think I'm talking about tables, right, for layout, but I'm actually talking about something that predated tables, and that is called the frame set. Has anybody ever used frame set, even heard of frame set? Just a couple of people? Okay, let me tell you about the frame set. So first, let's just take a look at this beautiful code, right? Back then, for some reason, HTML was in all caps, shouting case, as I like to call it. And if you look at the attributes like margin height and frame border, right, their values aren't even quoted. And the frame tags, they're not even self-closing. We don't have a close of it. They're just the open tag. And yet the browser was able to still parse it and make it work. I don't know how, but it did. So here's the layout of the contrived example that we'll see. So we have these frames all over. So we got one frame, right? Frame 1 that spans the top. Then we have frame 2 on the right, frame 4 on the left. So maybe 2 is some sub-navigation, 4 is ads, let's say. And then frame 3 in the middle is like this flexible area that will fit the content. So let's take a look at this code. So first we have this frame that's pointing to an actual HTML page, right? So there was a page that was just for the header, that was just for the nav, and it's some HTML page, kind of like iframes now. And then secondly, a frame set could be aligned either in rows or columns. You know, sound familiar with some new CSS features? And frames could also be nested, right? So notice here in it that asterisk symbol there, right? So what it means is that this one will take up 3 columns, 20% on the left, 20% on the right, and then the star in the middle meant it was flexible. It'll take up whatever space was remaining, right? So that's kind of pretty fancy for 20 plus years ago, right? We're just now getting tools in CSS to be able to do the same thing. But back then, you know, our visuals were mixed up with our markup. So frames by default had this like ugly border around them. So we needed to turn those off, right? By setting the frame border to 0. However, if we decided to keep the borders, right, they could be resized. So there was an attribute to tell it to not be resized there. And in the end, that's why we had iframes. That's why they came along, because they were frameless, not resizable frames there. So this whole setup was to help us avoid having to reload the whole page, right? If you click the navigation, the only thing that would be changing was the content in the middle. We didn't want the whole page to have to refresh and to have to go back to the server, which back then took a long time because you were hitting some relational database and then come back to the page, right? So it's kind of like our responsive apps that we build now, where we click this one space, we have a client-side routing, and then certain component changes. So that's what this name equals content there is about. We named the frame for a purpose. It lets us be able to change that content from the nav without having to refresh the page. So this is nav.html here. So like I said, it's an isolated HTML page like an iframe, but all of the links, when you click it, don't change the page, they change another frame, and they change that by the target attribute. So we probably all use target equals underscore blank, right, to load up a new tab or new window, but target originally had a different meaning, was to target that frame to change that frame to a new page. And also, for some reason, we, or at least I, had these li tags for lists and didn't close the li tags. Yet it still worked somehow, some way. So apparently frame sets are deprecated now. They were deprecated in HTML5, but they're not obsolete. So they still actually work in the browser. So if you've been keeping up with web standards, of course, you know that all of this stuff can be done with CSS Grid now. So this is the same implementation of the markup before, but now split up into HTML and CSS there. So the presentation and the markup are separated. And now we can do more sophisticated things like put the main tag above for SEO purposes, right? And this is also responsive on mobile, whereas my frame one was not. So if you go to my website on your phone, it's going to look terrible, horrendous. Okay, but CSS Grid, that is way too fancy, right? So let's go back 20 years yet again, okay? So let's say we have this schedule here for HalfStack Charlotte right here. So let's just say we want to do something super simple, okay? All we want to do is indent, right, the name of the session 40 pixels in. That's all we're trying to do. And normally we will just use a margin left, let's say, to indent it. Or maybe we're on some kind of bootstrap grid system and we'll burn a column and it's aligned. All these kind of ways we would do this in CSS. But what do you do when there's no CSS, right? And there was a time when there was no CSS, or at least not all the browsers supported CSS. So can anybody guess what the solution may have been? What do you think? Oh, yes. Also known as the spacer GIF or GIF? GIF? GIF. I'm not going to go into that. Okay. So this is what it was. Transparent image, right? So it was a 1x1 pixel that was transparent, and we could size it to whatever size we wanted to. So you want to indent something 40 pixels in, well, you make the image, you size it to be 40 pixels wide, 1 pixel tall, and bam, it's indented, just like that. So it could work in the vertical direction, it could work in the horizontal direction. And since it was a 1x1 image that was transparent, it was like super small, right, in the bytes, basically. And we used to use them all over the place for pixel perfect layouts back then. All right, so like I said, responsive design wasn't a thing, so we didn't have to worry about the sizes having to change, but it's what we did. So for this problem, though, we could also use non-breaking spaces potentially, but those are always font dependent and such, so you may not be able to get things to line up. So we always use the GIF. Okay, and then CSS became a thing, right? So we had HTML and we had CSS, which was super awesome. So no longer did we have to put text, link, or background colors right in the HTML body. Used to do that. No longer did we have to use the font tag to style everything. So I used to use, instead of using a span, it was font, font, font everywhere. Especially because tools like Dreamweaver used to output font tags everywhere. But unlike the frame set, font is now obsolete in HTML5, so it doesn't even work in browsers anymore. It's quite sad. Of course, we used to use tables, right, for table layouts, but no longer do we have to put the styling in the table, like border color and things. We could actually use a separate CSS file for that. However, what I ended up using CSS the most for when I first started out was to change the default link styling. Imagine that, right? So now when I hovered over something, it could be a different color. I could make the visited link yellow instead of default purple. I could do all kinds of cool dynamic, quote unquote, things. But really, CSS in the beginning was just about taking the styling out of the HTML. There wasn't anything really super cool that CSS could do then. It was CSS 1, I guess, back then. So CSS 3 was, you know, way off in the future there. Okay, so we talked about frame set, right? Talked about spacer GIF. Just talked about styling, right? Now I want to share something that was near and dear to my heart, okay? Like, legitimately. So if you remember in the beginning, I had that poll, right, on the speeds, internet speeds. It had square corners on all the corners of it. So it was a box, right? But what I really wanted to do was to have these rounded corners. They were called, I used to call them pods or whatever. And they were popularized by Yahoo, I want to say. And even the screenshot I showed of Amazon had the rounded corners there. So they were really popular in the 90s or early 2000s, I will say. Then the late 2000s, Google came out with their material design that made everything flat and monochromatic, boring, basically. But now the rounded things are seeming to come back, so everything is cyclical if you hang around long enough. So anyway, you would think that I would be able to throw a border radius on it and move on. That's like 5 seconds of work. But what happens when border radius doesn't exist yet, right? That didn't come out until 2005, right? And that's 6 years away from then. And even though it existed in 2005, it took 5 more years for all the browsers to adopt it enough for me to use it. So, what did we do to solve that? Well, back then, a pod to have rounded corners, I would have to cut it up into a grid of a 3x3 grid, okay? And those rounded corners would be images in order to make those rounded corners. So it would be an image that somebody would cut up in Photoshop or whatever the image tools we used back then. And the upper left, the upper right, the bottom left, the bottom right would all be an image that would be perfectly aligned with the pod. So the header that says weekly poll, that could be have a normal background in blue and white letters. And even the side pieces could be in the gray, but those corners had to be images. And we would use tables, of course, to line everything up. So it could look something like this. So every pod had to have at least 4 images. And hopefully they all looked the same and all had the same size, so we could reuse those images. But if they wanted different colors or different radii, I guess, they would all be different images, which would be horrendous for the page if you think about it. And if the designer ever said, oh, let's change this to a 5-pixel border, or I want the color to be red, I would respond and say, okay, well, you give me those 4 new images, and then I can make it happen. So that iterative cycle took forever. And there was actually this small point in time where tables were shunned for being used for layout, but we didn't have border radius yet. So that was a very, very difficult time then. We don't talk about those dark times. Okay, so this is HalfStack, right? So we know how important JavaScript is to our ecosystem, but there are plenty of times where backend engineers would laugh at JavaScript and say it's a toy language, you can't do much with it. Even though, all of these examples you've been talking today about sophisticated things you can do with JavaScript, you can have all of these low latency, highly concurrent node servers, you can build node CLIs with it, all of these UIs with service workers, like all these things we could do with JavaScript. But rewind to decades ago, JavaScript pretty much was a toy language, right? So here's something I used to do on my website. Whenever somebody would visit my website, I would pop up an alert and say, hey, welcome to my website, which is actually very similar to those requests for notification pop-ups that show up now, or, oh, I want your location. Can you tell me what that is? So it's still cyclical, just not as bad as what I used to do. and we had the script, and I had the script in the head tag, which we now know is poor for performance. Document.writeLine was there as well, because unobtrusive JavaScript didn't exist back then, and even putting things on body on load instead of event handlers all existed back then, because jQuery didn't come out until mid 2000s, like 2006, 2007. So had to roll all of these things ourselves, right? So imagine, right, trying to debug my website, and every time I went to the page to check, there was an alert that popped up that I had to close. Then I had to click to do whatever I wanted to test. And if I ever, put an alert in a loop and had an endless loop, I would have to Control-Alt-Delete, shut down the browser in order to keep testing, right? So there were no debugging tools at this time. All I had was alert debugging. So I would have a variable. Oh, what's this variable's value? I'd have to alert it, save it, refresh the page, get the alert. Okay, test it. Because there was no console back then. Like, we take the console for granted now, right? That we can just throw whatever we want in the console. And even now, console debugging is considered subpar. But really, alert is all that we had. And speaking of debugging, in IE, whenever a user would come across an error in the browser, it would tell everyone that this error occurred, right? With this super cryptic message, right? An error has occurred in the script on this page, invalid, whatever. So, and like every user would see this, even the folks that are not tech savvy or anything. So it was a usability nightmare. And it was very motivating to not have any errors on the page, because you didn't want this popping up. And then Firebug came along, right? So that was like late 2000s, 2006, 2007. And it's possible that people here haven't heard of Firebug. It used to be like the canonical name for inspectors before, Firebug fell out of favor or got replaced, basically. But it was an extension to Firefox, and it had a console that you could debug in. And it was like magical, because I could change the CSS right in the browser without having to change my code, right? I could put in breakpoints in the code, which was like mind-blowing at the time. And Dylan, we were talking about it at lunch. Like, it's the reason I switched from IE to Firefox, was because of that, because of Firebug, right? It really was revolutionary. Like, we take it for granted now, all the things we can do in the Chrome Web Inspector, or Safari, I guess, if you use that browser, and all the browsers, right? Now those are table stakes, but back then that was like what set up the whole Ajax revolution and everything else we can do with the web now. So in these days, finally, we have all these development tools that are at our disposal. Like, we were just talking about all the things that we have to think about and figure out and what we want in our platform. And this is all before the code even gets to the user. It's like all these things that try to help us to not ship broken code, right? Because in the past, like I said, I used FTP and was saving right there on the server. And back then in IE, if you had a dangling comma at the end of an object definition or an array, it would actually fail and break the whole page. So there are all kinds of ways that we could break things, because there was no prettier, no uglify, anything like that. So, question before we wrap. Can anybody name all 9 of those? But how about you just shout out the ones you can see? Jest, yep, up there. Jest for testing. Vercel, the triangle. Of course, yes, NPM that we use to get our modules. GitHub, right, where we store all the code. There was a time which is the 1/4 at the top? Is that what you're saying? Shoot, now I've forgotten what it is. Yes, ESLint. Yes. I was like, what? Of course, ESLint. I was talking about that'll catch errors. So, yes, prettier on the left, VS Code, TypeScript. That one is SWC, which is a new, I guess, a replacement for Webpack, I guess. Funny story about that. So, keep the files down. So I interned at Yahoo, and what we would do with our CSS is we had to write each class on one line, no matter how many properties there were, because we were trying to save bytes because of white space. So you'd have the property, colon, property value, no space in between, semicolon, next thing, right? And no space between the curly braces or anything. And I had a friend who was interning at AOL, and in their JavaScript, they wouldn't allow them to write any comments because it wouldn't get stripped, and it would make the file bigger. And why make the user have to deal with that extra weight because you wanted to comment on what the code was doing? So all bad. So we have all of these tools, and it doesn't even talk about the frameworks like React or Wind, Next.js, all those kind of libraries there. Cool. Yeah, and that's it. Okay, so yes, almost done. That's almost it. So as the conference is wrapping up, Dylan's about to wrap us up. I wanted to take time to actually, for us, to thank Dylan. All right, so let's give him a hand clap for putting this on, putting all the half stacks. Yes. Okay, and if you're interested in anything that I just talked about, I've got my information up there. Reach out to me on Twitter, email, whatever the case may be. And I hope you enjoyed this ride on the Wayback Machine. Yes, now I'm done. Okay.
The first ever monetary donation the Dojo Foundation gave out was $1,000 to Firebug.
Oh.
When they were first starting.
Nice.
Because we found it very useful and we wanted to support them. And the reason they stopped working on it is they got acquired by Facebook. They were the first ever acquisition by Facebook.
And that's what killed it?
$10 million.
Oh, $10 million?
For the two of them.
Wow.
It was Joe Hewitt and Blake Ross.
Yep.
$10 million in stock back at Facebook in 2009.
Oh, yeah, that's worth a lot more than
it was a good deal for them, yeah.
What? Yes,
I can't
comment.
remember what it was that Crawford put an alert in. Was it JS-lint or was it the JSON library? He put.
I think it was in
JSON.
JSON.
Hotlink it from his server or something. It's like a JSON parsing library.
Yeah.
But he put an alert in it. The web broke for however long.
Oh, on accident, he left it in
He
there.
put it in to stop hotlinking my thing.
Oh.
Alert. Script injected everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the character.
Yep.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
Fun fact, for me it's the other way around. So I got to the party a little bit later, so I switched from Firefox to Chrome because of Firebug, because I found it more difficult to use in
Yeah.
Chrome content.
Yeah, definitely. So it was great because it was new, but then it was super slow. And then Firefox actually adopted it, right? So it became part of Firefox.
And then rewrote it.
Yes. And then now Chrome came out. It was, yeah. And then it was a lot faster. So, yeah.
I heard one thing you said. Now the console debugging is subpar because of editor debugging on it.
Well,
Yeah.
compared to breakpoints.
Yeah. Breakpoints. Yeah. Putting the debugger statement, stuff like that. So, yeah. I just grew up on console debugging, so I just use it all the time, especially with async stuff going on and race timing. But,
Chris Hellman did a poll a couple of years ago, and it was like 80% of people just use console.log.
yeah.
Even today. Yeah. So.
Definitely. And now Copilot writes console.logs for me when I want to test, so that's great. Cool. Handing it over to you.
Thank you, Ben. That was awesome. So many good memories in that talk.